Hi guys, this is Asal. I'm studying for the bar and I wanted to review my notes with you. So today I'm studying evidence and I'm studying the attorney-client privilege rules. So actually, this rule is very important because this rule comes up in your civil procedure class, it comes up in your evidence class, and finally in your last year when you're taking professional responsibility, you'll see the attorney-client privilege rules over there too. So I really suggest you really pay attention and really know these rules, because if you're going to be an attorney, you want to know your rules. So what is this for exactly? So the attorney-client privilege rule is actually meant to facilitate and promote communication between the attorney and the client. So what do I mean by that? Basically, the attorney represents the client, and the attorney must be able to best represent their client. So the client should be able to go to the attorney and communicate openly and freely. So that's why we have the attorney-client privilege rules. So actually, this rule comes from the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure 503B, and it states that a client has a privilege to refuse to disclose confidential communications made for the purposes of facilitating the rendition of a professional legal service to the client. So this rule is actually very important. It has the three elements. The first element is a confidential communication. The second element is made between the attorney and the client. And finally, the third element, it must be made to facilitate legal services. So that's very important. So what is a confidential communication exactly? A confidential communication is anything that is intended or reasonably understood to be confidential. And what is a communication exactly? A communication can be verbal and it can be non-verbal, and is also intended to communicate. The next thing I would like to talk about is the difference between an attorney and a client. So who is an attorney exactly? Am I an attorney here? I'm standing in front of the camera and just reviewing my notes for YouTube. Does that make me an attorney? No. An attorney is a person who's authorized or reasonably believed to be authorized to practice law in the states. And also, a client is a person or an entity who obtains legal services. And the next thing I would like to talk about is, what do I mean between an attorney and a client? I mean between someone who comes to the attorney rendering legal services. So a client comes to the attorney to obtain legal services. So there's actually 4 exceptions to the attorney-client privilege rule. The first exception is the crime fraud, the second one, deceased client, third one, breach of duty, and the fourth one, joint client. So I would like to actually get into it a little bit more. What do I mean by crime fraud? I mean that, let's say that there's a client. The client comes to the attorney asking the attorney to commit a crime fraud with him. So in this case, there's an exception. There's no more privilege. The next thing I would like to talk about is the deceased client. Let's say that there's multiple parties in an inheritance type of situation. Then over here, the exception also applies. The next thing is when there's a breach of duty, and for example, let's say the client is suing the attorney for malpractice, or let's say that the attorney is suing the client to get his fees. So when there's some sort of a breach of duty, over there the exception applies. Finally, the last exception is the joint client exception. So how does this work exactly? Is when there's multiple clients, 2 or more clients, and suddenly they're against each other. So that's where the exception applies. The next thing I would like to talk about is how the attorney-client and the work product doctrine rules apply. Because anything that is prepared in anticipation of litigation is privileged. So, what I just talked about were the exceptions, the crime fraud exceptions, the deceased client, the breach of duty, and the joint client. And finally, I talked about the work product doctrine, that is anything that is prepared for in anticipation of litigation. So I really hope you enjoy studying attorney-client privilege. There's actually a lot more to this rule, but I really wanted to make a really short video because I want to make another video for professional responsibility. So I really hope you enjoy studying attorney-client privilege. Good luck.